Is Georgia reeling, or is Tennessee walking into an ambush in Athens? And what role does Nico's injury status play in the biggest game of the Vol season? Welcome to the Volunteer State. I'm Tennessee beat writer Adam Sparks, along with John Adams of the Knoxville News Sentinel. On this episode, we're going to break down the Tennessee-Georgia game, which has a huge impact on the college football playoff picture. We're going to discuss the potential disarray that the Bulldogs appear to be in. And most importantly, the health of Nico Iamaleava, the Tennessee quarterback that left the Mississippi State game last week with what's being called an upper body injury. We'll discuss that. John, I guess let's go ahead and get into that first, the Nico injury. We're recording this on Monday, where Josh Heupel gave another update, if you want to call it an update, on Nico's status. Now, so just some of the details. I said upper body injury. That's what Tennessee is calling it officially. That's usually code for concussion. And I think it's that term has appeared on a lot of other podcasts in the around Tennessee. So I don't think there's a whole lot of mystery to it. We're calling it an upper body injury. You can be a little more lax, I think, in a podcast episode. Concussion symptoms, I think it's fair to say what it is. Josh Heupel, after the game the other night, said it was a precautionary measure to hold Nico out. And I can say I know there was some concerns about whatever symptoms Nico was having, even if they were light, that there were concerns that if he went out for the second half, he would walk into the flashing lights in Neyland Stadium, left over from the halftime show, dark, bright. Those lights go back and forth during warmups. The noise, the music, just all these different things that are not great if you even have the slightest concussion symptom. And so they held him out. Josh Heupel said it was a precautionary measure. And then we asked him again today. This is at Monday's press conference. And let me just read to you what Josh Heupel said, and you can sort of react to it. I think I will too. Josh Heupel's asking about Nico's status. He said, Nico's with us today. He had a really good day. We feel like he'll be in great shape for Saturday, but you guys can monitor the SEC availability report on Wednesday and track it throughout the week. We certainly feel like he'll be in a good spot. John, I consider that maybe this is sort of a Rorschach test, which it's in the eye of the beholder. If you listen to that, or if you read that and hear that he's in great shape, feel like he'll be in a good spot on Saturday. Like if you want to be reassured that Nico's going to play, you can certainly in that quote from Josh Heupel. But if you're the type that gets nervous over these things, you can certainly find some reasons for concern in the ambiguity of that. And even the fact that he referenced the so-called availability report of the SEC could get you nervous as well, because what Josh Heupel is referencing is the availability report, which is essentially an injury report that comes out of Wednesday night. It's updated on Thursday, updated again on Friday night, and then updated again 90 minutes before kickoff. And he seemed to be hinting that Nico would be on that report. Now, Wednesday night, if Nico is doubtful on that report, people may lose their mind. Certainly if he's out on that report, people may lose their mind. But I don't know, maybe he's not on it at all. If he's practicing at full go, either you have concussion symptoms or you don't. So if that's really all this boils down to, he may not be on it at all, which could make this even more interesting. If Nico were limited or out or anything like that, Gaston Moore, the backup quarterback, would be the guy that would lead the Vols at Georgia. John, I think Nico's going to play, but I'll be honest with you, I don't know, and I'm waiting on pins and needles to see how this all plays out. John, can Tennessee beat Georgia if Gaston Moore is the quarterback from start to finish?
Well, I guess if Carson Beck has his worst outing, he's had a few bad ones, and Tennessee can play great defense, maybe they could not turn the ball over. I think what was really curious to me was about you were talking about the ambiguity of the medical report. What I liked was Nico was with us today. Like, oh, at least we don't have to worry about him leaving the program. He's still here. He's on campus. That's a good thing. So I think it would be certainly challenging to play Georgia without your first string quarterback. However, Georgia's not playing well right now. And I go back to the Ole Miss game. Ole Miss really put a whipping on Georgia, dominated it physically in a 28-10 win, just beat it on both the offensive and defensive lines. And I think Tennessee has an even better defensive front than Ole Miss does. Maybe not any better in the front four, but when you factor in all the backups and the way Tennessee uses that 12-man rotation, I think Tennessee is capable defensively of doing exactly what Ole Miss did to Georgia. So the fact that Tennessee hasn't given up more than 19 points to anybody, that makes me think, even with Gaston Moore, provided Tennessee protected the football, could hang in the game.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of putting it. It's strange that that of all years, this would be one where Tennessee would have the best chance to beat Georgia with a backup quarterback, because Gaston Moore he's fine as a backup quarterback. Gaston is serviceable, capable, all these adjectives that we put on backup quarterbacks to say that they are good for what they are, but not good enough to be a starter. That's how I would term Gaston Moore. He can finish a game for you, which he did against Mississippi State. Did everything he needed to do. But it's not like he's one of those guys that you say, well, if he was on another team, another Power 5 team, another Power 4 team, he would start. You can't say that about Gaston Moore. So he is what he is. So Tennessee has a good situation at backup quarterback, not a great situation. Yet this is a year when we can say there's a chance a backup quarterback could go and win there. Now, I wouldn't put a nickel on it, because that crowd's going to be raucous. Georgia's still a really good team, a top 10 team. And the game plan for Georgia would be different if Gaston Moore is in there. Nico hasn't run the ball a lot, but Gaston Moore's not going to run it much of any. So it would be 8 men in the box for a lot of the game if Gaston Moore was back there, and they would bring a lot of pressure and see what they could do against him. But Nico's got to play in this game if Tennessee's going to win it. I just think you've got to have, the formula for this game is Dylan Sampson has to have a Dylan Sampson type game minus the fumbles. The defensive line has to play like Ole Miss did and get after Carson Beck. You need to win the turnover margin, which used to be really hard against Georgia. It's very plausible Tennessee could win the turnover margin against this flawed Georgia team. And, you just got to finish off drives. And there's been a lot of criticism about how Tennessee has been in the red zone. I had a piece last week that showed Tennessee has been terrible between the 10 and the 20. They've been actually really good between the 10 and the goal line. Last week, they weren't very good in that area also. I think you can make field goals in this game instead of touchdowns, though, and hang around, because I just don't think Georgia is going to explode on offense. I think this is a game that's probably going to be in the 20s. But Nico, I think, needs to play, and he needs to play well. John, I would assume your pick is not in for this game yet. Mine isn't. But doesn't this have sort of a 20-something to a 20-something kind of feel of a game?
Yeah, like 23-20. Like the two teams combined for 6 field goals. I think it will be that kind of game. I think it would be hard to finish off drives. The thing about Georgia, when I look at Georgia's offense, I don't see anything really positive. Beck is in a complete funk, 12 interceptions in his last 6 games. Nate Frazier, the freshman, has been Georgia's best running back the last few games, but he keeps fumbling the ball. Wide receivers are not making plays. They aren't stretching the field. They aren't beating anybody deep. They aren't turning short passes into long gains. All those things. And the offensive line could not handle Ole Miss. just couldn't. It was overwhelmed physically, and that's really unusual. This is just not your typical Georgia team, and even on defense, Ole Miss came out early in that game, and the receivers were so open. Quarterback Jackson Dart, playing on a bad ankle, got hurt on the first series, but the receivers were just often wide open in the secondary. We saw that against Alabama too, in another Georgia loss. So I think, in looking at this game and imagining how it could go, the first thing you need to do is say, this isn't a typical Kirby Smart Georgia team. It just isn't.
Yeah, and there's some issues off the field at Georgia as well as on the field. I enjoy sometimes listening to podcasts that cover the opponent, and this weekend I listened to some of Georgia, and boy, that things seem to be falling apart. I mean, Camelot is crumbling. It seems like in Athens. Now that this is a team that's Georgia's still a national title contender if they can beat Tennessee and get to the playoff. But and now listen to Kirby Smart's Monday press conference, and you sort of had that feel as well, just from some of the questions. I mean, so off the field, everything that Georgia is doing right now is being critiqued by its fans. Carson Beck was smiling on the sideline the other day. That was a big deal. How is this guy getting beat in the biggest game of the year, and he's over there just, smiling ear to ear? He gave I believe his answer to that was that a teammate was trying to encourage him and acknowledging that by smiling or whatever. But these are the kinds of things that you find when you have a fan base that's really, really angry that you're underperforming. Jake Pope, who is a special teams player for Georgia, was jumping up and down with an Ole Miss player when the fans stormed the field, and it was caught on camera. Georgia fans flipped out about that. At Monday's presser, Kirby Smart called his own player an idiot for doing that. So,
That's great stuff.
Also at Monday's presser, wide receiver Colby Young, who played early in the year, played okay. He hadn't played, I think, in a couple, 3 games. He's facing battery and assault charges of his, I think, ex-girlfriend and her unborn child, I believe. And Kirby Smart had to field questions about his status, his legal status. And so you put all that together, and we know all the racing and speeding, drag racing, all those issues that have been around Georgia for the past few years. So then if you look on the field, fans are put out with Carson Beck. Guy's driving a Lamborghini, but he's throwing 2 or 3 picks in a game. There's injuries and inconsistency on that offensive line. I'm told the offensive line for Georgia is going to be healthier this week than last. It certainly needs to be against Tennessee's pass rush. And there's, as you mentioned before, John, there's not like an elite NFL caliber receiver or tight end on this offense. All that being said, John, I have this feeling that Tennessee is going into a hornet's nest. And I would have to admit that's influenced a lot by the game 2 years ago. Tennessee had a lot of confidence going to Athens 2 years ago and got beat. That was maybe the loudest crowd I've ever heard at a stadium, was when Georgia beat Tennessee 2 years ago. Kirby Smart loves to just find these little nuggets to motivate his team. And the college football playoff poll is not out as we record this, but once it is, Tennessee's going to be ranked higher than Georgia. It's already ranked higher in the other polls. Georgia's a 9-point favorite, but Kirby will be able to say, hey guys, everybody's piling on you, all this outside coming in to the SEC title game. John, is it right for me to think that Kirby Smart is going to get this Georgia team right exactly where it wants to be for Tennessee?
I think Kirby Smart he's what, to me, maybe the best motivator in college football. I think Dan Lanning, who used to be on his staff and is now at Oregon, is really good too. But if you look at some of the games, big games Georgia's played, how dominant it was and how it's performed in the clutch, he really has an ability to connect with players. It doesn't just sound like a generic pep talk. He knows what buttons to hit, and he's very genuine in the way he goes about it. You're right. You've given him so much to work with. Georgia just got manhandled by Ole Miss. He'll question their manhood. Georgia tumbles in the poll. Tennessee moves ahead of it. Here's what people think of you. Kirby will never, ever mention, oh, by the way, guys, we're 9-point favorites. That won't happen. No, it's going to be all doom, despair. And here's what this is a message he loves to convey. Here's what other people think of you. They don't believe in you. They think you're overrated. They think you're done. They've already written your obituary. They're throwing shovel on the body there in the grave. I'd really like to hear his talk this week in practice and right before the game, because I think it could be epic. However, whatever tricks and whatever oratorical skills he might put on display, we get back to the fact that Georgia's just not as good as it used to be. It just isn't. And I don't know how you get around that. Yeah, maybe it can play better. Maybe it'll be more inspired, particularly at the outset, and it'll get the crowd behind it. But when I look out there on the field, I'm not seeing the kind of defensive stars I saw in Georgia's 2 national championship games. And I'm not seeing the playmakers I saw at wide receiver that I saw in those teams. And I'm not seeing a quarterback like Stetson Bennett, who you knew in the clutch was going to come through. He was money. He made plays even when things were breaking down. I don't see that with Carson Beck. And just watching Carson Beck, he's not inspirational. He just doesn't have that ability about him. His body language, even in the best of times, isn't great. He just looks a little too laid back, kind of out of it. And he wouldn't inspire me in a huddle, I don't think.
Yeah, I think there's probably no question that Kirby will get this team to turn it on. It's just a question of what are they turning on? Because if it's not there, it's not there. There's some talent to this team, but if 3 out of your 5 offensive linemen are out of position, or if they're backups, it shouldn't necessarily be in the starting lineup. Like, you can't fix that with motivation. Carson Beck's poor decision making, it's hard to fix that. You can fix it with focus, I guess, during the week, but you can't fix it with, a rah-rah speech. I expect Georgia to play one of its best games. I don't know that I expect Georgia to play its best game. And somewhere in between those two, I think Tennessee has a chance to win the game. I do love Kirby's. Some of the best coach motivators are these types that sort of will say, yeah, people are saying, people are saying. It makes Kirby a great motivator as a coach. Would make him a poor journalist because he usually doesn't cite what people, who are these people that are saying these things. John, I probably told you on our podcast before that I early in my career I covered a college coach that used to take the newspaper and hold it up in front of his team in the pregame and would just say statements that the team would then think were written in that paper, where he would say, I can't believe that defensive end, thinks you can't block him. And I can't believe this opponent you're about to play would say something like this. None of that was in the paper. But I would be told in the post-game press conference. So this is when I covered Middle Tennessee, MTSU. I would be told in the post-game press conference, like, we showed them, we know what you wrote, and I didn't write any of that. But he knew some of his players were not reading the paper, I suppose. So people are saying, John, that this is a game that will greatly impact the college football playoff picture, and I think that's absolutely accurate. We've only got 3 weeks left in the season. And there's only like a handful of games that are matchups of like two potential playoff teams. I think I just perusing before the podcast, I think I came up with 4. Notre Dame still plays Army. Either of those teams could get in the playoff. Be a tough road for Army, but either of those could. Tennessee, Georgia, Indiana, Ohio State, and then Texas, Texas A&M. I think that's about it. Now, there could be upsets at a number of teams that are in the playoff picture, and we've learned the last few weeks those are almost for certain going to happen. But if you look at the picture now, there's just not a whole lot of time for a lot of these teams to drop out. If Georgia loses this game, they're almost assuredly out of the playoff picture because they would have 3 losses. If Tennessee wins this game, it's got a pretty clear path to the SEC title game. It would need to beat Vanderbilt, and then it would play the winner of Texas, Texas A&M in the SEC title game. Tennessee would most certainly be in the playoff at 11-1. If Tennessee loses this game, it'll be in the pool of bubble teams. And we won't go through all those. If Tennessee does lose Saturday, we'll certainly go through those next week. But depending on how you look at it, if Tennessee were to lose this game, they would be like one of 9 teams fighting for 7 at-large spots, or they would be, 6 SEC teams fighting for 4 spots, that sort of thing. In any event, they would have an okay chance, but not a great chance. So, John, I say all that to say this. How concerned should Tennessee fans be about their playoff chances if they go down to Athens and they lose?
Well, I still think there's a decent path to the playoff. I think what it can't have happen, it can't suffer a blowout loss. Georgia's won 7 consecutive games in the series. None of those games were close. Now, the rain helped Tennessee one time because Georgia shut it down in the second half and won by only 14 points. But that wasn't the kind of game it was. So Tennessee has to avoid that. If it got blown out by Georgia, that would really raise questions. If it were in a tie with another 2-loss team, because Tennessee without a win over Georgia has one good win. It beat Alabama, but nothing. What's its next best win? Maybe if it can beat Vanderbilt in that season ender, maybe that would be it. But when you're pointing to Vanderbilt as possibly your best win, that tells the story. So it just has to, hope it wins the game, and then it doesn't have to worry about that. And I agree with you; it'll end up in the championship game for the SEC. I think another game that could really impact Tennessee if it's 10-2, if it plays a close game, loses a close game to Georgia, is Indiana in the Big Ten. I think Indiana has to play Ohio State. If Ohio State blows out Indiana, even with 1 loss, I would think a 2-loss Tennessee team could finish above Indiana. Now, if it's a close loss, I don't know about that. Indiana can't point. It has no marquee win, and that really hurts it. It passes the eye test. It's overwhelmed a lot of opponents. It usually beats the point spread. It didn't against Michigan this past week. But if it plays badly and gets beat significantly by Ohio State, I think a 2-loss team, not just Tennessee, I think that creates a possibility of 5 SEC teams in the playoff if Indiana would fall by the wayside.
Yeah, you want to if you're Tennessee and you lose this game, you want it to be close and competitive because you sort of want to be in that pool of Alabama, Georgia, Tennessee, sort of this round robin of teams that are all pretty similar but beat each other. And then Ole Miss looks as good as any team in the country. At least they did against Georgia. They would be in there. The Texas A&M winner would be in there. There's a number of SEC teams that would have a case. You just want to be in that mix, and you kind of want to be paired with Alabama to some extent, where if you can hope that there are two spots open and Tennessee and Alabama could fill them both, because I think there's going to be a lot of consternation with the committee of which one of those would get in. Alabama, sort of by the metrics, would have the better resume, but Tennessee beat them head to head, and their resumes are going to be close enough that I think the committee would have a hard time putting Alabama, but not Tennessee. But it can certainly do that. It's made hard decisions in the past. I think you're right, John, that if Indiana lost to Ohio State and lost handily, couple touchdowns, maybe even more, then the committee could say, hey, listen, you had a weak schedule. Your schedule's ranked 100th in the country. You had your shot to show that you belong, and you blew it. And there's a difference between not letting an undefeated team in. There's a difference between that and not letting a one-loss team in. And that's where Indiana would be if they lost that game to Ohio State. So Tennessee needs to win, and they've got a great path to the playoff and to the SEC title game. But if they lose, just be in it, be competitive, deal with the hostile crowd, look like a team that could beat anybody in a playoff game. The closer we get to the playoff, and the more that I see these matchups on the screen on Tuesday nights and what they potentially could be, I do think there's part of the committee that looks at that and says, we want a good product in the playoff, and we don't want to put a team in there that is going to embarrass us, that's going to go in and lose by 28 in a first-round game. You want a team that can go in, be competitive with absolutely anybody under any circumstances. And if Tennessee plays really well and even loses a close game at Georgia, I think that would send that message to the committee. It would be great for Tennessee's case if they could show that the offense had really clicked. And before Nico got hurt, passing game was looking pretty good. Mississippi State's also terrible. But if that defense keeps playing the way it is and Dylan Sampson keeps running, I do think there's enough of an element of so-called football people in that room, coaches, former coaches, athletic directors with strong ties to football, Hall of Fame players that will look at that and say, this may be the best defense in the country, home or road. And that's one of the best 2 or 3 running backs in the country. And if you can point to those two things and that travels to Georgia and then comes back to Neyland, I think it helps quite a bit. But if you go into Georgia and you're overwhelmed and your offense does nothing and your defense gets exposed a little bit and you lose the game by 17, then you got to start praying once you get back to Knoxville that somehow somebody else will lose to get you in. Is that sort of where it is, John?
Yeah, I agree. And I think anybody that follows Tennessee, if you were going to make a case for Tennessee at 10-2, and you're trying to break a tie with somebody else, you bring up a really good point. Nobody is going to blow out Tennessee, I don't think, because of the defense. The defense can keep you in the game. Now, you might need some offense and a playmaker at quarterback to beat the best teams. But when you talk about being competitive, the defense can make Tennessee competitive. I think something else that helps Tennessee is that Alabama game. It's the only good win Tennessee has. But if you look at what Alabama's done, it scored 30-something on Georgia, looked almost unstoppable in building a 28-0 lead in that game in Tuscaloosa. And look what it did to LSU, going over 40 points on going over 40 points on LSU. And looking like, well, nobody can tackle Jalen Milroe. He looked like Vince Young leading Texas to the 2005 national championship. The fact that Tennessee did stop that offense, there's nothing you can point to with that defense and say it's not real. It's got the talent, the depth, it's got the stats, and it's got a marquee game. We talk about Heisman moments. That's usually for a quarterback, sometimes a running back. But when you look at Tennessee's defense against better offenses, Alabama, an example, it made a case for itself. And so I think that really works in Tennessee's favor. I'm glad you brought that up. I said the committee doesn't want somebody to go out there and embarrass it and lose by 4 touchdowns. I don't think that would happen with Tennessee.
Yeah, they don't want an anomaly. They don't want a big question mark. In Indiana, if they get in, good for Indiana. But Indiana is the type of team, I think, where the committee would say, we don't know if they belong or not. I think they would look at Tennessee certainly to this point in the season, and they would say, yeah, that team belongs. That team can play within a field goal of any other team in the bracket. And we're going to get a good game of Tennessee's in it. But, Tennessee could just put all those arguments aside and win the thing in Athens. And that's certainly doable. I think it's more doable than it has been in the last few years of this reign under Kirby Smart. That game is going to start Tennessee at Georgia, 7:30 p.m. Eastern. It'll be on ABC. We'll give you all the coverage that you need before, during, and certainly after the game at KnoxNews.com. Please subscribe to this podcast, share this podcast with your friends, and thanks for listening to this edition of the Volunteer State.